Welcome to the Commercial Real Estate Podcast powered by First National. I'm Aaron. He's Adam. Recording live here at the Land and Development Conference in Toronto as part of our speaker video series sponsored by Fuller Landau. Our guest today is Ene Underwood, the CEO of Habitat for Humanity of the Greater Toronto Area. Ene, thanks for joining.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
For anybody that doesn't think we're actually at the conference, you might be able to hear a little of background noise. We do get caught in these moments with a lot of traffic in the background, but I think it adds ambiance to the fact that we actually are at the conference here today.
It's the energy. There's a vibe going on. It's a lot better than recording in our little 70 square foot huddle room that we record at the office.
And on that note, I actually want to acknowledge Informa, the organizer of the conference, designated Habitat for Humanity GTA as the charity receiving the honorariums for the speakers have been repackaged as a donation to Habitat GTA. So we really appreciate that.
Oh, that's great. Well, maybe there's a good segue. Before we get right into it, why don't you just talk about your background, Ene, and what your career has been like to lead you to where you are today?
Yeah, so I've unlike most people wandering around at this conference whose careers have been entirely in real estate, mine's an 11-year story. I've been at Habitat for Humanity for the last 11 years. My career actually started in the private sector doing strategy consulting with a company called McKinsey & Company. But my intention when I got my MBA, which kind of led me to strategy, was actually to end up in healthcare. So I spent 17 years in publicly funded healthcare. Then I had a 3-year stint in child welfare, publicly funded child welfare, and by the end of that, I think a couple things were clear. Number one, I was kind of tired of publicly funded anything and wanted to get back into a context where I could use business thinking to do good. But the other thing that was really clear is that, what causes people to end up in need of our healthcare system, what causes families to be in need of our child welfare system is the adequacy or inadequacy of housing. So being able to have an opportunity to then, spend this last chapter of my career in the housing sector, using business thinking to do good, has been incredibly meaningful and energizing.
What is Habitat for Humanity?
So it's Habitat for Humanity has this interesting positioning of being well known to many, many people, a well-known brand name in North America and globally, but not known well. So in fact, what Habitat for Humanity is, we're a housing charity, of course, a global housing charity, but we are focused fairly exclusively on creating pathways to home ownership. And the reason for that is our origin story actually dates back to it was inspired by an organization of another name in the American Deep South that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of the last century was mobilizing the community to help black sharecroppers, so descendants of black slaves, be able to build a home that was adequate for their family and take the rent that they were paying anyway, actually, to landowners who themselves were descendants of slave owners. So take that money they were going to pay for rent anyway and turn it into equity. And the notion was that combination of a home that's adequate for your family plus the ability to build equity creates opportunities and options of moving forward generationally. So, creating generational advancement, social inclusion, generational wealth. And so that kind of seed of our history, fast forward now to 2024, is very much at the forefront of what we do today. So in there's 2,000 people or however many people are at this conference, and when I opened my remarks earlier, I asked for a show of hands on how many people are homeowners. So 95% of the hands went up. And in Canada and North America, we understand that. Home ownership, if you are a homeowner, the average in Canada is 13 times, your wealth will be 13 times your annual income. If you're a renter, your wealth will be 3.5 times your annual income. And those numbers are getting wider and wider apart over the years. And I'll stop soon, but I think it relates to this other piece of if you're a homeowner, the chances are that your parents were homeowners, especially now. If you're in your 20s or early 30s and you're a homeowner, probably your parents were homeowners and they probably helped you become a homeowner. And this is a country that was, built on the notion of anyone who works hard and saves a bit and has some discipline around saving can own a home. And that created a country of opportunity. And so for us at Habitat, we are saying that's still the country that we want and embrace, and have a model, which I'd be happy to talk about, is how do we now still create home ownership as a possibility for working families with incomes that are nowhere near what's required to buy a home, in our case here in the GTA.
Two thoughts, and I don't want, and I don't mean to sound contradictory, but I think I'm forming the concept in my mind. How do you marry that with sort of the Europeanization, or you hear these people say, well, hey,
Sure.
it's okay, everyone's going to grow up a renter because that's the way it works in Europe, and that's just a natural evolution as urban evolution, right? Like, it just occurs. Our cities are 200 years old, theirs are 700 years old, and they've just evolved further ahead than I do. And just second, because I think it's probably the same concept, the concept of urbanization, where you can't just have endless sprawl, and part of the attraction and part of the strength of the European cities is that they all rent, and so they all live much closer to the city center, and they all live in a much more condensed, easy to commute sort of neighborhoods, right? And this home ownership belief, at some point you're living 2.5 hours outside of the city center, and it just makes no sense, right? How do you marry all that concept with Habitat for Humanity?
Yeah, well, and I think it brings into, I think we are at a time now as a nation where we do have to rethink some of the fundamental images and definitions we have in our mind of home and community, right? So first of all, let me respond to your question about hey, but in Europe half
everybody's
or
a
the
renter
majority,
or whatever,
everyone's a
yeah.
renter, so what's so bad about renting? And I think the difficulty is in North America, we evolve differently. Our financial systems evolve differently. Our social safety nets evolve differently, and so it's not a simple matter of rewiring North America and how the North America economy and social systems work to then magically have what works in Germany or Austria work here. And so that I think that would be the first part of the thing. But then, your comment about ownership equals sprawl, to paraphrase.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. No, that's exactly what I was getting at.
That's where I, as I said, I think, we are in the middle of a different conversation about what does home and community look like. So, I'll speak.
It's not picket fences and big backyards. It doesn't have to be anyway.
Ownership doesn't need to be that. It no longer is. What people are buying now is very different than what the two of you probably bought, and certainly what I bought in 1996, right, of what was possible then. And so certainly for us at Habitat for Humanity, again, I think for most people that have heard of us, the image in folks' mind is probably a bunch of volunteers helping to raise walls on a single detached kind of Dennis the Menace kind of home.
Like the 1970s image of Habitat for Humanity,
sure,
right?
Yeah. And I grew up in rural Ontario, so where I grew up, that still is what a Habitat home looks like, and that's appropriate for where I grew up. But here in the Greater Toronto area, what we are doing and advocating for at Habitat for Humanity is a denser form of community and living. So all of the homes that we ourselves build are stacked back-to-back townhome kind of communities of, anywhere from 15 to 50 kind of homes in a community. And we also work a lot in developer partnerships where we're negotiating deals with developers and communities they're building, some of which are often high-rise communities, right? But negotiating for family-sized units that become Habitat homes and are still ownership homes, and create that possibility of building equity in something that does look different than we thought of with home before. You may not be driving up to the front door. You may not be driving. Right, so increasing numbers of our homes, especially with developer partnerships, don't have parking either, but are in transit accessible areas.
We had a conversation before we hit record that I just kind of wanted to bring live onto the podcast. Ian highlighted this is an affordable ownership model, and Aaron and I spent a lot of time talking about affordable here, but virtually all in the context of affordable rental. Of course, we are biased in that way, in that we finance a lot of rental, but with a lot of the government initiatives at all three levels over the last handful of years has been a hot topic, to say the least, predominantly geared towards rental incentives. So what do you see, in that space, from government incentives for paths to affordable ownership? And of course, as always, what could the government do better?
Sure. So thanks for that. And bear with me, I may go a bit long in responding to this question. So I think the first and important point is to acknowledge we all recognize in this country we underinvested and we underincented rental housing for years and years and years. You folks know that, so I don't need to re-litigate the stats on that and why it is a good thing that our governments are now getting really serious about purpose-built rental and affordable rental. Bear with me for a second because I want to first talk about how our model works, because that will then I want to knit that back into the conversation that we were having about how do we as a country create to some extent more of what Habitat's doing right now, whether it's under the name Habitat for Humanity or new organizations to proliferate. So as we've talked about, Habitat's an ownership model. The way we make ownership work we work exclusively with working families. So the way we make ownership work is we're still a zero down payment model, so volunteer hours in lieu of a down payment. But we then work with our families and our outside lending partners to enable families to have a first mortgage, so that's the one they're paying on a regular basis, first mortgage with an outside lender that's calibrated to family income. So in our case, that may mean the first mortgage is $200,000, $300,000, might even be $400,000 depending on income. We then backstop the difference between that first mortgage and the full market value of the home with a second mortgage held by Habitat for Humanity on which no payments are required, at least until the first is paid off. So that's how we make it affordable from the moment a family moves in, to get them in the door and there and building equity. But the other thing that we've done with our model, and this is a change we made 4 years ago, we've said it is great to help families build equity for all the reasons we've already discussed. But we will always need more affordable housing in this country. So how do we make sure that we're also retaining these affordable ownership homes as affordable in the long term? So we're building the asset pool of affordable housing, not just affordable rental housing, but affordable ownership housing. So the way that we do that is when families buy with us, the agreement of purchase and sale that they enter into has a clause that has a buyback provision that says when they are in a position to move on, they will sell their home back to Habitat for Humanity at a preset formula, which basically gives a guaranteed minimum appreciation on the value of their first mortgage that roughly equates to inflation. So now if you think about that for a family, what it does is, okay, now you're in a home that's adequate for your needs. You're now in a better position to grow your income. And our stats say Habitat homeowners grow incomes at a greater rate than the market average. So now you can grow your income, you're building equity. So now you're in a position to build a down payment to go buy a market home. And so it creates that financial incentive. Use this as your first home. Go buy a market home. Habitat's going to buy your home back and make it available to another income-eligible homeowner. And if we now think about our entire stressed housing system, especially the affordable housing system, that kind of a model means that now we've got a relief valve for our rental system. Because our challenge now, how many people do we all know who are still renting, who would really like to own, but can't jump that chasm between rental and ownership? So by doing this kind of model, we're actually creating that housing mobility that used to exist, where you can start in, it could be subsidized rental, then you're moving to market rental, and now you can start moving towards full home ownership. So I think the position, and this is a conversation we had before the podcast started, it's our view that we, as a nation addressing this affordability challenge, we need to actually see a significant growth of what I'd say is this new housing asset class, which is equity building affordable housing. And that's a place that at the moment there's little Habitat for all over the country, but not delivering a whole lot of homes. And there's a couple other affordable ownership providers. But how do we create a investment context to bring more investment capital into this kind of asset class so that we are creating mobility for all the new rental stock we're creating? We still are providing options for people to say, yeah, I'd still like to own a home someday.
In this high interest rate environment, any turbulence with the buyback model? Obviously, last couple of years, the value of your buyback price would have been pumped up quite a bit.
It must be a floor. Like there's a buyback floor, so there's some sort of certainty on the sale, but they get the upside if the market's moved up.
So first of all, there's a floor for the homeowners, which is you're never going to lose your equity.
Right.
So that's a different model, right?
Than
in a market ownership
Yeah.
model. So that's the first part of floor. And for us, I mean, we've done a lot of financial modeling, and we have purposely been quite conservative in what we are guaranteeing to homeowners, so that we're not candidly setting up future Habitat for Humanity for financial stress by buying these homes back, right? But in most of our homes, we also have the option, if needed, we can sell a subset, like sell, 10% of future Habitat homes that we sell them to the market to cross-subsidize what we're paying. But the intent is still making sure, when all this effort goes into creating a Habitat home, whether it's volunteer built or through a partnership with a developer, that we're making sure the opportunity it creates is actually multi-generational, both for the first family moving in the door and the impact it has on them, but for future similar families that are looking for that kind of opportunity.
How many units?
So not enough. So I mean, it's
never enough.
It's never enough.
Yeah.
Last year we had 70 homes under development across the GTA, and another 20 developer partnership units that were coming through. This year we are finishing those, and we're on deck to start 2 or 3 more projects. And we have land at the moment for on 7 different parcels of land, and lots of people talking to us about more. The challenge now, of course, is the same as for anyone building. The land is one part of the equation, and the other is money. So on the money side, there's a lot of things we continue to work on in the government around grants, concessions, et cetera, as well as the philanthropic side.
Of course.
Yeah.
What's the average ownership period? I mean, you have an existing pool. Obviously, you're managing and operating. So how long? What's the average cycle?
Yeah. So the challenge on this is, I think the historical answer will be different, Adam, than the future answer. So I made reference, and what I've spent a lot of time explaining is the model we're selling now, but that has only existed for the last 4 years in that way. So our historical model was one where the homeowners were getting almost all of the appreciation upside. In spite of, and the historical model was also where you got more home, right? We were typically building townhomes, but you could drive your car to the front door and there was room for a little kiddie pool in the backyard. And so that's not what we're selling anymore. And there was often an unfinished basement that you could finish for as your family grows. So historically, our turnover has actually been fairly low because people say, I'm putting down roots and I'm staying here. Yeah. Our expectation, as I described, is I suspect in the future we'll see a higher turnover, in part because we've created that financial incentive to do so, and also because families are growing. So to be clear, we also are not saying to families, you got to move in the next 10 years. Like, this is like any other home. You're legally a homeowner. Put down your roots. If you, like I did, I bought my home in 1996. I haven't moved. I love where I live. I love my neighborhood. So I make the choice all the time. I'm staying here. That is the choice that is also available to Habitat homeowners.
It's part of the reason I ask, because typically the life cycle of a home is quite long, especially if you're gearing it towards families.
Sure.
Yeah.
What obligation do the homeowners have as a reporting to you to validate that they continue to work and all that kind of stuff? Yeah,
so so there's an annual cycle where we're touching in with homeowners, and so we get their notice assessment or their kind of financials every year of where are they at now. That's also why we are able to track.
Because the idea here is that they come in,
doing.
they take advantage of your generosity to grow their income, to grow their footprints, their ability to support themselves and then move on, I guess, is the idea.
Sure.
So that the new family can come in and take advantage again, not just stay there in the long term. Although I know you say there's no obligation for them ever to leave, but the idea is that there's a cycle.
Yeah,
right?
Well, and the other obligation they have is to be the primary occupant. So as I said, that annual review also includes, are you still living there?
Yeah, because not to be negative, but there's clearly you have to protect yourself against being taken advantage of
absolutely.
to a certain degree, right?
Unquestionably. Yep.
Does the model work in like a condo building format, like where you have some units within a condo building with your structure?
Yeah, and we're doing that. So first of all, everything we ourselves build at Habitat for Humanity GTA is set up as condo, right? Because they're all multifamily, they're townhomes, so there's some degree of common element. So we're then setting that community of families up to collect, we help them set up a condo core and over to them. But I've made a number of references to developer partnerships. So we have easily 25 different developers now with whom we have some form of partnership. Most of the time that will be for finished units in developments they're doing. So, to give you an example of that, near where we are now doing this podcast is Liberty Village. There was a big development in Liberty Village called Ordinance. Altera was part of that. Citizen, I believe, was part of that. That was originally a Create TO project. When that was negotiated, that included a negotiation of 25 of the units built in that kind of, I think, two or three tower community would be Habitat for Humanity units. So they were transferred to us at a fixed price that we negotiated, that we then made available to homeowners. You're using exactly the same model as if we had built the home ourselves. And so then, they're just living in that condo as part of a condo core. Another cool story is Tribute was doing a development across the street from Old Maple Leaf Gardens. They had already gone to OLT regarding density. They came back to us in part because a neighboring developer got more density than they did, and they came back to us and said, if they went to committee of adjustment for another 5 stories and one of them they'd make available to Habitat for Humanity, would we support them? Answer to that is yes, because Aaron, going back to your question, we are supportive of intensification in our communities. And so that was now 4 years ago. There's 8 families living on a single floor in a tower near Old Maple Leaf Gardens who are all Habitat homeowners. Their neighbors on other floors probably don't realize they're Habitat homeowners, but they're Habitat homeowners, and they, exchange cups of sugar and babysitting and all kinds of other things like any other community.
Cool. A minimum 2-bedroom?
Yeah, because our focus is families and generational change, we have traditionally focused, and even with our developer partnerships, we're always pushing minimum 2-bedroom. Having said that, last fall we did kind of start a new program which we called First Home, which is targeted towards the singles and couples that are saying, I might want to have children someday, but I can't afford to have children because I
still need to build the equity.
I got to build the equity, and I have to have like a home to start a family. So we've started a program called First Home for that demographic.
So your mandate obviously is affordable ownership. What would your view be on kind of broader market applications? Whether it was a means tested subsidy for people to buy their first homes, or something aligned to the government that was just units that would be outside of your sphere.
Sure.
But I mean, and to the best of my knowledge, I don't think there's anything like that in the marketplace. But is that something that you would advocate for?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to my comment about that. I think we all need to think harder and push our governments harder on creating this, a growing middle space asset class, right? And that means that's more than a Habitat for Humanity to serve it. That's let's invite new participants into that market. The couple things I would say is we know historically that and Habitat for Humanity International has done a big study on this idea of creating affordable for good ownership developments. You still do need, or you benefit from having a nonprofit player to do that, to do exactly what you've referred to, of the kind of the screening, the pre-qualifying, and the preparing for success in home ownership. But I think there is a scenario to say, okay, but how might you do that of setting up, nonprofit players, and municipalities, do RFPs for who will your nonprofit providers be that have that dual thing of screening, pre-qualifying the first applicants. But the reason, again, for why you need that nonprofit is to steward that resource at the time of buyback, right? To do the buyback and the resale. And
maintain it as in a unit used for affordable, or
for affordability.
The middle gap.
Yeah.
We're at the Land and Development Conference. Maybe let's just talk through an exercise, just because I don't understand it fully. I'm a developer, buy the land, going to build, approach you, you approach me to participate and to provide units. I guess I'm giving those units. I'm not gifting those units, but I'm giving them to you as a discount. Like, how does the developer participate? Not only am I building it, so I guess maybe it's just the cost, but I'm obviously not selling it to you as a condo at market value. And so, am I just taking that discount? How does it play out? How do developers? If I'm a developer listening right now, how would I use this? And then of course, what are the incentives and sort of government involvement to encourage developers to partner with you guys?
Two great and interrelated questions. So, I opened by saying, part of what attracted me to Habitat for Humanity was it's a social enterprise, and how do we use business thinking to do good? So in the same way that every development has its own idiosyncrasies, every developer may have their own ambitions, priorities, etc. Every conversation we enter has a degree of customization. So it does begin with, what are you building? What are you trying to achieve? What are your pain points in your development? How can we help? So there's a few standard things that we use. So through Bill 23 in the province of Ontario, development charges are now exempt for non-profit developments. That's still a bit tricky when it comes to if the product is built by a developer, but that's the first thing that we work on with the municipality is, can we agree that the DCs on these units will be exempt? I use the tribute example, right, of a density bonusing. So a lot of the time that's part of the discussion that we'll also have is, what's possible here with density bonusing, and then what does that translate into in units? Historically, and again, Section 37 in Ontario is now defunct and being replaced with CBCs, but we use Section 37 quite a bit to say, how do we redeploy some of that Section 37 money for units? So large sites policy, right, and requirements through large sites. So it will depend on the development how we then kind of mutually negotiate what is possible here. We're not coming penniless in the sense that, as you heard me describe the model, we know we will be able to access through our homeowners a first mortgage, right? So we'll say, well, okay, what can we expect? And what's our average income target for this? Adam, picking up on your point, what's our guess as to what the interest rates will be? And so what's that going to turn into? What's our mortgage that we have to offer? And then it's just,
how much do you have to put in behind?
Yeah.
And did you put that in behind all the way up to market value, or is the developer is kind of expected to
I'd say
play ball a little bit?
I would say again, it depends. I think if you talk to most developers, well, I don't know if you talked.
Don't put words in their mouth.
When I think of projects that we have done, I think there are some projects we've done where the development has come out financially intact or indifferent, right?
Yeah.
Where,
if it's neutral, and at the end of the day, there's a Habitat humanity component to it. That's the best outcome.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I'm fine if the developer comes out intact, in the sense that if we still are delivering a societal good that we all want, and therefore leveraging developer capacity to do it, fantastic, good outcome. We, of course, as you would expect, we do push developers to say, you're part of, building, like your very business is part of developing the community. You rely on, your own future relies on having staff employees that can afford to work here. So you've got skin in this game, and therefore do you really need to get that capital stack to get all the way up to kind of the same as everything else. And again, we recognize that also depends on what the investor kind of lineup is lying behind it.
Absolutely.
So, and we have a couple developers. The one I'll shout out in particular, because they've been with us the longest, the Daniels Corporation. They've been with us for more than 25 years. For them, this has always been philanthropic. So their approach to this is they literally vend into their pro formas. When they're doing a project, they say, does this feel like a project where there should be Habitat homes? Yes or no? If yes, they just vend into the pro forma the loss they're going to take. It ends up being 0.04% loss in a development, and then they say, okay, Habitat, here's what we can do for you.
They can sleep better at night.
In this high interest rate environment for traditional first mortgages, is that making your job more difficult in order to place families?
Sure. Yeah, it's affected absolutely everyone that's trying to build anything.
It always comes back to
commercial,
interest rates, eh?
Commercial, industrial, residential. It's hurting all of us. So and it hurts us on the same way that it does the for-profit world. It hurts us on financing costs, the construction financing, and it's made a difference on our mortgages. Now we've been really fortunate in our lending relationships to have one lender in particular, Meridian, Canadian who's been, really thoughtful in how they approach this to give the Habitat homeowners kind of the best and most favorable rates possible. So, but yeah, absolutely, interest is a big part of this equation.
It is for everybody, unfortunately.
The other
Good
thing,
or
if I
bad.
may, and sorry, Aaron, this is coming
of
back.
course.
You were also asking what else can governments, do, and so I think I'd flag two things. First and foremost, HST. You folks are in the rental world, and so it's how significant it has been that our government's finally and appropriately moved on having any kind of rental product exempt from HST and GST. Our homes at Habitat for Humanity are still paying HST and GST. So, and in our case, because that's based on the full market value, we're paying $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 of HST. So in our case, for every 100 homes we build, there's 13 we don't build because we're still paying HST. So that is something that we're, to us, it just feels like it's respectfully a no-brainer for our federal government to move on that and just extend that relief to affordable ownership. And to be clear, affordable ownership that has this kind of nuance to it where we're creating products that remain affordable in the long run. The second thing that I keep pushing on is how can governments be more creative, and candidly, how can the real estate finance sector be creative in pushing governments to come up with the appropriate tax incentives and tax credits to enable more private, more both institutional capital and private capital to come into the kind of work that we're doing. So in the U.S. there's low income housing tax credits, which enable to change the cost of capital and enable money to come in and support some of this kind of development. We don't have that here. We haven't been as creative around that as we need to be, in spite of the fact that we're about to see the largest transfer of generational wealth in the history of the modern world. So those are things we just have to push harder and be more creative than we have been in the past. Of how do we make it easier for individuals to donate to organizations like ours, but also for investors to put capital behind this so that collectively we're getting more of the housing built that we need to have the employees that we need to keep our communities and our cities working.
You touched on the U.S. there briefly. Which countries are getting it right?
No idea.
No idea.
You two are the same as me. You'll read something from another country and say, wow, that's pretty cool. I read something about Singapore just last week, right? And just how they have really creatively structured kind of ownership models. And yet, Singapore is a very different country than Canada, in a whole lot of ways. And so some of the things that look attractive elsewhere, we talked about Europe before, people love pointing to Austria and the percentage of housing there that's government built. So there's a lot of things that look really good. But I don't have kind of the magic kind of inspiring insight of, ta-da, here's the formula that we've got. To be fair, I'm sure you folks would agree. I think there's way more good things that our governments have started doing than not, right? Like we talked about GST, changing the CCA, the depreciation rate. I've got the wrong words, but on rental, like that's a big deal. That's a
you're seeing lots
change.
of municipalities, amend their planning to make easier development. Like you're seeing lots of small things, and I think the answer is always going to be a whole bunch of things that end up doing it. It just at the moment it always feels like it's just not quite enough.
No, and it's not, and we're not. So another hat I wore was I was a member of Ontario's Housing Affordability Task Force that reported in February of 2022, and we really did push for very aggressive and bold measures, and I've often spoken before about our recommendations and said that this takes a level of tolerance on the part of the public to tolerate a version of democracy and of messiness that we're not used to. And, I think certainly here in the province of Ontario, we've witnessed a government that, may not have, used the same approach and form and process that people are comfortable with, but was certainly trying to be aggressive, did a lot of things. Public didn't respond well to that. So we can have an entirely different conversation about, did the government get it right? Did the government get it right, and how it's responding to the public's reaction? But we do need a more tolerant public to enable this notion, change the conversation about what home and community is. And that's certainly true for people like me. I'll speak to myself, who are privileged enough to have owned a home, live in a lovely community. I got to embrace a community that has twice as many homes on my street. That's part of how we get out of this. But we also need to embrace an Ontario that doesn't just say we can't expand urban boundaries. Like, we just have to have this fixed. Let's not expand urban boundaries. Let's have a more intelligent conversation about expanding urban boundaries. But let's talk about, as we do, what kind of housing gets built on the other side. Mm-hmm. That picks up, Aaron, on what you said before about sprawl. Like, okay, let's not have sprawl, but let's acknowledge that greenfield development can happen faster than infill development. And so how do we be kind of thoughtful and smart about how we build
and ensure the infrastructure and the transportation ability is adequate? We are out of time, unfortunately, Ian. Thank you very much for taking the time to come on and join us.
Thank you both for the conversation.
Thank you to First National for powering the podcast. Thanks to Informa for hosting us here at the Land and Development Conference. And thanks to Fuller and Landau for sponsoring this episode. Ian, thanks again. That was a great conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you both.